The BBC fired Jeremy Clarkson over a cold steak. His response was to construct a media empire worth more than his entire career at the corporation. But no one in the television business has properly articulated what actually happened. They didn't lose a presenter. They manufactured a rival, handed him 1,000 acres, a production crew, and Amazon's bottomless wallet. Because Clarkson's farm was never really a farming program. It was the most costly act of revenge in British television history, and it reeked of silage. They had absolutely no idea what they were witnessing. Let us return to March 2015. Jeremy Clarkson is the BBC's single most valuable on-screen asset. Top Gear commands audiences of 350 million globally. It is not a motoring program. It has not been a motoring program for years. It is a comedy show, wearing a car show as a costume. And that distinction matters enormously, because comedy is what Clarkson does by instinct, and engineering is something he merely pretends at. The BBC understood this. They weren't naive. They knew precisely what they had. And then, somewhere in a Yorkshire hotel, an incident unfolded. A cold steak, a short-tempered presenter, and a producer who found himself on the receiving end of both. The BBC, confronted with a choice between their most commercially valuable asset and the basic standards of workplace decency, chose decency. One cannot entirely blame them for that. One can, however, observe what followed. Clarkson, Hammond, and May departed the BBC. Amazon, recognizing a commercial opportunity of rather extraordinary proportions, signed them immediately. The grand tour was commissioned. Amazon reportedly paid Clarkson somewhere between 10 and 12 million pounds annually for that program alone. But here is the detail that BBC executives presumably revisit during quieter moments. Because the grand tour is not the real story. The grand tour is merely the prologue. What Clarkson constructed using that Amazon relationship, what he assembled quietly in its shadow, that is the story. And it begins not on a television stage, but in a field. Specifically, 1,000 acres of Oxfordshire farmland acquired in 2008 for £6 million. At the time, his friends assumed he'd taken leave of his senses. The property market was collapsing. The farming community was politely confused. Even Clarkson seemed uncertain about his own logic. He wrote in the Times that land is a stronger investment than anything a bank can offer, that the price of food can only travel in one direction. He was correct. Though even he could not have anticipated quite how correct, or quite what he would eventually do with it. That land, Diddley Squat Farm, is now valued at £12.5 million in land alone, before a single business built upon it is factored in. He doubled his money simply by holding it. But the land was never really the point. The land was the stage. When Amazon Prime commissioned Clarkson's farm, the reaction from Britain's agricultural establishment was one of courteous skepticism, edging toward mild annoyance. A television presenter, a man whose principal professional gift was saying outrageous things about cars, was going to muddle through harvests. He was going to make spectacular errors. He was going to quarrel with planning inspectors in an entertaining manner. Farmers would watch and wince. City dwellers would watch and find it endearing. It would complete one series. Everyone would move along. What nobody in British agriculture had grasped, because they had never had cause to grasp it, was what it actually means to have a television program watched by millions of people across dozens of countries, every episode of which is an unpaid advertisement for your farm. Let me state that again, because it is the entire foundation of what Clarkson constructed. Every episode of Clarkson's farm is a commercial for Diddley Squat. Every tractor malfunction, every ruined harvest, every blazing confrontation with Kaleb, all of it functions simultaneously as entertainment and as marketing. And Clarkson is not paying for any of it. Amazon is paying for the production. Amazon is paying for the distribution. Amazon is delivering it to hundreds of millions of subscribers across the world. And every minute of that programming is, at its core, an advertisement for a farm, a shop, a brewery, and a pub in Oxfordshire. The farm is not the business. The farm is the film set, and Amazon is covering the rent. This is the maneuver the television industry missed entirely. They were watching Clarkson's farm as a television program. They were assessing it by the metrics they understand: ratings, viewing figures, critical reception, streaming numbers. What they were not doing was examining what the show was constructing off-screen, because off-screen, it was constructing something extraordinary. Clarkson's Farm became Prime Video's most watched UK original series. Not the most watched farming program, the most watched anything. The series that was intended as a light distraction between Grand Tour runs turned out to be the most significant British commission Amazon had made, and by the time the industry grasped what was happening, the flywheel was already spinning. The farm shop began as a shed. This is not figurative language. It was literally a converted outbuilding with some potatoes, a hand-painted sign, and, within weeks of the first series airing, a queue that extended further than anyone had thought to prepare for. The economics of Diddley Squat Farm Shop should not hold together. The produce is priced at a premium. The opening hours are erratic. The parking is, to be generous, insufficient. By every conventional retail measure, footfall modeling, margin analysis, competitive pricing, it should have quietly folded within 6 months. Within a year, the business had grown from £44,000 in assets to over £1.3 million. That is not a hobby finding its confidence. That is a business being born in a field in the mud, with a slightly bewildered farm manager watching on. What the shop genuinely created was something far more valuable than revenue. It created pilgrimage. People do not queue for 3 hours to visit an unremarkable farm shop. They queue because visiting Diddley Squat is, for a particular type of British viewer, an act of participation. They have watched this place on their screens. They recognize the gate. They know the lane. They know Kaleb's expression when something goes wrong, which is frequently. And they travel from Nottingham and Newcastle and Norwich to stand in that queue and feel, in a way they cannot fully articulate, connected to something that seemed genuine. A jar of honey priced at twice what Waitrose would charge is a perfectly reasonable sum for that feeling of connection. And the queues confirm it, week after week. West Oxfordshire District Council, confronted with this new and somewhat alarming reality, began refusing planning permission for expansions. They declined the car park application. They shut down the restaurant with enforcement notices. They turned down submission after submission, citing the area of outstanding natural beauty, the effects of commercial activity on rural character, the pressure on local infrastructure. They believed they held leverage. They were substantially mistaken about that, because every refusal became a storyline. Every enforcement notice became a narrative thread. Every planning inspector's report became drama that millions of viewers consumed from their sofas with mounting exasperation. The council believed they were the regulatory authority. In practice, they were unpaid co-writers on a television program that grew more famous with every objection they raised. Visitor numbers climbed each time the council said no. Every headline about a planning dispute was free publicity. The council's opposition was indistinguishable in its effect from a very well-funded marketing operation. Clarkson was operating in an entirely different game. He understood, whether intuitively or deliberately, that conflict is content, and the council was supplying it at no cost. Make sure you press the subscribe button and tap the notification bell. And do like this video if you're finding it worthwhile. It takes a single second and it means quite a lot. Now, the brewery. In Series 2, Clarkson grew some barley and elected to produce beer. The brewing industry was not alarmed. They had encountered this before. The trajectory of celebrity alcohol brands follows a completely predictable and entirely manageable arc. A famous person licenses their name to an established drinks company. That company handles the actual production. The celebrity appears at launch events and receives a percentage. It is a licensing arrangement dressed up as entrepreneurship, and the established industry knows precisely how to handle it. Wait for the brand to reach a certain scale, make an acquisition offer, fold it into existing distribution, extract the value. Hawkstone did not follow that pattern. Clarkson actually built a brewery, with real equipment, genuine brewers, and functioning supply chains. The barley comes from his farm and neighboring farms within a few miles, not from wherever happens to be cheapest that quarter. From Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire, from farmers who now have a guaranteed buyer at a fair price, rather than the indifferent mercy of the commodity markets. By 2025, Hawkstone had recorded sales of over £2 million, with 134% annual growth, ranking as the 23rd fastest-growing private company in Britain, and stocked in Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, and over 2,000 pubs nationwide. And here is the detail that separates Hawkstone from every celebrity drinks brand that preceded it. Carlsberg reportedly made a private approach with a £50 million acquisition offer. Clarkson declined within 24 hours. Because Carlsberg, and every other major drinks company that has presumably entertained the same thought, cannot acquire Hawkstone without dismantling what Hawkstone actually is. The barley comes from Clarkson's fields. The narrative comes from the television program. The brand is inseparable from the man, the farm, the show, and the Oxfordshire landscape. Without the local sourcing, without the provenance, without the transparent supply chain viewers have watched on their screens, Hawkstone is simply another lager with a famous face on the label. The large breweries found themselves rather awkwardly unable to compete. They operate on scale. Hawkstone operates on story, and in 2025, story is worth considerably more than scale. Then came the Farmer's Dog, a pub constructed within the farm's grounds, committed entirely to British produce. No Heinz ketchup, no Coca-Cola, nothing sourced from beyond these islands. Black pepper from Cornwall at 10 times the cost of the imported variety. British beef rather than cheaper alternatives. A wine list so aggressively domestic that it reportedly caused the accountant something that can only be described as sustained clinical distress. Clarkson described the Farmer's Dog without apparent embarrassment as a brilliant method of converting 100 pounds into 94 pounds. It employs 146 people. It loses money on food with an almost aristocratic indifference to arithmetic and recovers that loss entirely on Hawkstone lager, where every penny of margin is retained. What appears at first glance to be a rather expensive eccentricity is, on closer examination, something considerably more deliberate. The pub exists to champion British farming. It exists to provide filming locations for future series of Clarkson's Farm, because a licensed pub on the premises is, among other things, a permanent set. It exists to sell Hawkstone at full margin to customers who arrive for the beef and leave having purchased the beer. It is a loss leader with a business model, and the business model is rather sound. The Britain-only sourcing policy warrants pausing on, because it is either the most commercially reckless decision in the history of British hospitality or the most strategically intelligent one, and the answer depends entirely on what you believe the pub is actually for. Every dish tells the story of a British farmer, a British field, a British season. The menu changes not because a marketing team has decided it ought to, but because British seasons shift and British produce follows them. This makes the kitchen slower, more expensive, and considerably more difficult to operate than any conventional pub. It also makes it entirely unlike any other pub in Britain. And people do not queue for ordinary pubs. They queue for the pub that is making a stand for something, even when, perhaps especially when, making that stand is costing its owner money. Britain has always responded warmly to principled stubbornness, provided it arrives wrapped in genuine conviction rather than manufactured performance. Then there is the Grand Tour tent. Clarkson's famous traveling marquee from his Amazon motoring series, the canvas structure in which he, Hammond, and May piloted increasingly absurd vehicles across increasingly dramatic terrain for the entertainment of Amazon's global audience, now sits permanently on the grounds of the Farmer's Dog, repurposed as a retail and dining space. Hops and Chops, a butcher's shop, the Farmer's Puppy, an outdoor kitchen, a piece of television history converted with considerable practical intelligence into a trading operation. Visitors who cannot secure a table inside the pub can spend money outside it, in a space that carries its own cultural resonance, its own story, its own connection to a decade of television that millions recall with something approaching genuine warmth. Every square foot of this enterprise is generating income. Every visitor is a potential customer, regardless of whether they made a reservation, arrived on a whim, or simply drove past and recognized the gate from the television. The entire site is architected, consciously or otherwise, to ensure that no one leaves without purchasing something. That is not coincidence. It is the Clarkson model applied to physical space. And then there is Kaleb. Kaleb Cooper was already working at Diddley Squat when Clarkson purchased the farm. He was 21 years old. He had grown up in the Cotswolds, not as a visitor admiring it from a comfortable remove, but inside it, working its rhythms, understanding its particular demands at the level that only years of direct daily physical engagement can produce. He knew the land completely and instinctively. He was also, quite evidently, entirely unimpressed by Jeremy Clarkson, not as a performance, not as a comic choice, simply because a man who genuinely understands farming does not naturally find himself in awe of a man who is learning it very slowly and very publicly. Britain was, it turned out, absolutely captivated by this dynamic. What followed across every series was essentially a young farming expert explaining basic agricultural reality to a middle-aged media figure, with the barely suppressed exasperation of someone who has been asked the same self-evident question 17 times before lunch. Kaleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He looked at Clarkson, sometimes with something approaching pity, occasionally with something closer to genuine despair, and delivered the sort of correction that in any other professional context would have ended the working relationship immediately. He was the audience's representative. Every rural worker who has ever had to explain how the actual world operates to someone who arrived with a confident opinion and no practical experience. Every tradesperson who has listened to someone in expensive casual clothing explain what they really ought to be doing differently. Every person who has watched a politician visit a farm for a photograph and return to Westminster having absorbed absolutely nothing. Kaleb was simply himself, in the presence of Jeremy Clarkson, doing his job. And Britain rewarded him for it with a level of affection that still catches people off guard, particularly those who underestimate how deeply this country values genuine expertise combined with genuine indifference to celebrity. His assets reportedly now approach £1 million. He has a live touring show, The World According to Kaleb, that sells out. His merchandise moves. His name on a product carries genuine commercial weight. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most improbable success stories British farming or British television has generated in living memory. But Kaleb's most significant contribution to the Clarkson empire is not the entertainment value, considerable as that is. His most significant contribution is a single moment in Series 1 that most viewers absorbed and moved past. He is explaining to Clarkson, quietly and directly, not why a piece of machinery has failed, not why a crop has underperformed, but why the entire enterprise as a pure farming operation cannot sustain itself. That an ordinary farmer with the same land, the same difficulties, the same input costs, the same relationship with West Oxfordshire District Council would not make it, could not make it. The numbers simply would not support it. Clarkson does not deflect. He does not reach for a joke, which is his habitual response to discomfort. He does not change the subject. He nods. It is the most honest moment in the series, and it lasts approximately 8 seconds. The program moves forward, and most viewers let it pass, but it explains everything that followed. Every brewery, every shop expansion, every pub, every merchandise line, every beer festival, every act of diversification is a direct consequence of that moment. A man who heard an uncomfortable truth about his circumstances and concluded that the only sensible response was to build something beyond the farming itself. Something that generates the income the farming alone cannot. Something that creates employment, supports suppliers, and has a genuine prospect of enduring. The Clarkson model in its entirety flows from 8 seconds of honest conversation in a muddy Oxfordshire field, between a man who knew the land and a man who was learning what land is truly worth. That is the empire nobody designed, and it is doing rather well. Let us return to that Yorkshire hotel in March 2015. The cold steak, the incident, the BBC's decision. The executives who chose not to renew Clarkson's contract are presumably still contemplating the arithmetic of it. Because what they did, in asking him to leave, was remove a man from the constraints of a single television show. A show that told him what to say, where to go, and when to return home, and place him in front of an empty field in Oxfordshire with nothing but time, capital, and the creative freedom that Amazon was rather generously providing. They liberated him, and in the space that disaster cleared, he constructed something worth £45 million in land value alone. Before the brewery, valued at £75 million. Before the farm shop turning over more than £1 million annually. Before the pub employing 146 people. Before the television series that none of his competitors in British agriculture have managed to replicate, because you cannot replicate it without the authenticity. And authenticity is the one commodity you genuinely cannot manufacture. What the television industry missed, what many in their boardrooms are still missing, is that Clarkson's farm was never a television program in any conventional sense. It was never a product to be commissioned, scheduled, renewed, and eventually retired. It was infrastructure. It was the marketing division of an agricultural empire. It was the narrative that made everything else cohere. Amazon funded the story. The story constructed the brand. The brand sold the beer. The beer funded the pub. The pub provided the next chapter. And the whole enterprise circles back, season after season, sustaining itself. It is not a farm. It is not a television program. It is a flywheel. And that 144 pounds of first-year profit, that catastrophic, hilarious, gloriously British failure, was the moment it began to turn. The television industry believed they were watching a man lose money on turnips. They were watching him assemble an empire, and they never saw it coming. There is something rather fitting about the fact that Clarkson, son of a Paddington Bear toy salesman from Doncaster, a man who spent 30 years being paid to drive cars quickly and say exactly what he thought, arrived at precisely the same conclusion that Britain's oldest landed families have operated on for centuries. Land endures. Honesty sells. A story told well outperforms any advertising budget. He simply added one element they had not considered. He pointed a camera at all of it. If you've enjoyed today's story, do subscribe and tap the notification bell, and have a look at what's on screen right now, which we think you'll enjoy just as much. Drop us a comment below as well. We genuinely want to know, did you ever make the pilgrimage to Diddley Squat? And was the honey worth the queue? Thank you as always for watching.